Everyone is talking right now about Israel and what they're calling Palestine, and about international law. And I'm going to, in the coming 90 minutes, so take your time, I'm going to make you the single most informed and authoritative people in Mexico on this topic. That means that when I'm done, when you walk out of here, you're going to know more, vastly more, than the politicians, the professors, the protesters, and the media. And this is going to give you what you need to understand, answer the falsehoods, and comprehend exactly what is going on now and what is the context. We're going to go back, so no one's ever going to be able to say, my grandfather was there before your grandfather. 3.5 billion years. First, this is Valbara, which is considered the oldest of the supposed pre-continents. And Valbara was a great landmass that broke up and created all the continents of the planet. Next. And as you see, what the countries you see and the land masses you see today were not necessarily the ones that existed before, because the water levels have come up and down, and there are plates that are constantly pulling and shoving on the planet. And here we see the Eurasian plate, the African plate, and right up here is Israel. And what this means is that a piece of Israel is constantly moving toward Asia, and a piece of Israel is constantly moving toward Africa, so that when you're at the Sea of Galilee, one side is moving this way to Asia, and one side is moving that way to Africa at the length of about a hair every year, a hair width every year. Next. The oldest city in the world, not settlement, but city, and not city-state, like Sumer. The oldest city is Jericho. It's right here, and the evidence is profuse for 7 walls. Naturally, when people were allowed to develop agriculture, they wanted to defend their water supply in their fields, and so they made cities. Oldest city, 7,000 years ago, is Jericho. Next. And the people of Jericho they were very spiritual, and they made skulls of their ancestors, and they put them in the walls and on the floors so that they would always be with them, so they had a sense of continuity. Next. So now we're going to talk about the Philistines. Now the word Palestinian comes from Philistine. So what is this name? Palestine, Philistine. It comes from the Hebrew word plishtim, which was one of the 6 Greek island invaders. And here is an example of the plishtim, the sea invaders, and this is on the largest such structure in Egypt, and they went against Ramses III, and as you can see, they have a Greek style headdress, and a Greek, they have the Greek sandals, the Greek skirts, they have the Greek shield and sword, and here the relief shows that they were defeated by Ramses and sequestered into 5 areas of Gaza, of the Gaza realm. And those 5 cities, the Pentapolis was Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and 2 others. And so this is the real origin of Palestinian. It doesn't mean an Arab. It means a Greek island invader. Next. So this is Israel, and Israel was one of the, here you see Philistia. Here are the 5 different Gazan cities. This area is called Canaan. Does anyone here know what the word Canaan means? Anyone? Francisco? You? Isaac? Do you know? It means purple. The color purple. Why? Because up here were the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians, which are named for blood red or purple in Phoenikos in Greek, had rule across the Mediterranean Sea. There was a seashell up here. And from that seashell, they could extract a pigment. And that pigment was the color purple. It took a great deal of work, and because it took work, it was expensive, and because it was expensive, it took laborers, and it became the color of the great ships, of the great regal robes, of the symbols, and they needed people to extract that. And so the people along here extracted that pigment, and the actual name at that time was Canaan, because there were no vowels at that time in the English transliterated language, and from Canaan they added the A's to make Canaan. They made Canaan. So there was no kingdom of Canaan. There was no king of Canaan. There was no dukedom of Canaan. Canaan was a region like South Florida or the Yucatan Peninsula, but it wasn't necessarily a government, and there were no city-states. There were some small city settlements, but when you hear stories that, well, he was a king of Canaan and all this, it's all just malarkey. Next. Okay, and as we see here, when the Jews settled into Israel, there are many, many, many items of antiquity. The Jews were there. They left. They settled in about 3000 BC, give or take a few hundred years, depending on which movie you love to watch. And the reason I mention all of this stuff about the antiquity and their presence is because there's such an effort to delegitimize the existence of the Jews in this land. And remember, this homeland is just a very short distance apart. So the people who made the land of Israel were from the area. They had come from just down the way from the Chaldean area, and then they came from Egypt and other places next. And they say there was no second temple, and of course we all know there was a second temple, because if anyone's been to Rome, you all know that here's the Titus Arch next, and we see in the Titus Arch that this is the sacking of Titus of the second temple, and with this gold and items of special treasure in Rome, they were able to finance the building of what structure? What structure? What structure? The arch. The arch? No, the Colosseum was built on the stolen goods from the second temple. Next. All right, now we want to talk about how the Arabs got. And that's the end of the lecture, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. You're just in time to see the conquest. Okay, so what's the definition of an Arab? Anybody know? Definition of an Arab?
Speaks Arab.
No, that's not it. Which?
Comes from the Arabic Peninsula.
That's correct. An Arab is a descendant of the Arabian Peninsula in the same way that a European is a descendant of the of the European continent. So, how do the Arabs get up here? So, in approximately 627, we have the third of the Abrahamic religions. We had Judaism, we had Christianity, and then in the 7th century, we had the splitting off with Muhammad and Islam. So this is Medina, this is Mecca, and Medina was originally a mixed city, especially with a large Jewish population. Anyone here speak Hebrew? So you know the word Medina means the city or the state. So that's Medina. So Muhammad comes into Medina and demands that they convert. They don't convert, and that's the first extermination in that realm. And he slaughters about 625, maybe 530, depending upon the number, Jews, beheads them in the center square, takes all their materials and their women, and heads north with what is known as the Islamic conquest, or the Arab conquest. And that conquest went up here, all the way into Asia, all the way across North Africa, and all the way up into Toulouse and Iberia, and it went here. And that is the Arab conquest. So they came into Jerusalem about 625, and they demanded that everyone convert or die. And if the Jews were put in a special category along with Christians called people of the book. They were allowed to exist in a state of humiliation as a second-class citizen called dhimmi. And they took a left here, they got rid of the Coptics, and then they stopped here. All of this became Muslim. And does anyone know why they stopped here in North Africa? Francisco?
Well, there's a desert to cross.
Desert, we're from the desert. They know deserts. Anybody else? Anybody else?
The kingdoms of Northern Africa.
These are all Northern Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah, but why did they stop here?
Because there were people there who were fierce.
Fierce? No. They were all Bedouins. And Arab basically is a Bedouin. Whether he's driving a gold-plated Rolls Royce or not, still Bedouin. The word bada means to sleep outside, and if there are two bada, it's the Badawin. So the Badawin became the Bedouin, and their role, their existence, was thieving, marauding, taking stuff from pilgrims, and their motto was me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, and me and my brother and my cousin against the world. So these are all conquests, and they stopped here because of the tsetse fly. Because the tsetse fly made it impossible for the horses, the cattle, and the camels to descend here. They could not go into Central Africa. Now, in the Muslim religion, the Islamic religion, everyone is equal. It doesn't matter if you're black, if you're white, if you're tall, or if you're short. You all have equal rights. But those who are not Muslim, not converted, are considered capable of being taken slaves. And this led to the Arab slave trade. And so, even though you've heard of the Spanish and Portuguese and Great Britain, British transatlantic slave trade, it existed for 1,400 years before the transatlantic slave trade. And whereas there was only 633,000 slaves were brought into the United States, there were tens of millions brought in across here to Arab towns, to slave markets, and they helped build the caliphate, and the fatality rate was nearly 90% because they didn't want these people to live, but just to let them work to death. And we even have remnants of this now. The word Sudan, you've all heard of Sudan, means black man. The word Zanzibar means city of the slaves. And there were many slave traders who owned tens of thousands of slaves. So Africa was depopulated by the Arab slave trade. And in fact, even now, the Arabic word in common usage for a person from Africa, anybody know it? Abid. Abid means slave. Next. Okay, so as the caliphate went back and forth between Syria and ultimately ultimately the Ottoman Empire. This was the Ottoman Empire, and as you can see, it spread and spread all the way into Europe, all the way here into Baghdad, and all the way across northern Africa, and is what we now call Israel and what was Israel. And they did not call it Palestine much, but they remembered that when the Romans expelled the Jews, the Romans renamed Israel Syria Palestina to forever wipe away the identity of the Jews. And so what this means is that the name Palestina, named for Greek island invaders, became attributed to the land in general. And so when the Muslims got there, they referred to it in a way as Palestina, based on the Roman name. And when the Ottoman Empire took over, they also called it the Holy Land, or Palestine, based on the Roman name that just stuck. Okay, next. And here's a typical map of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire did not label this area Palestine. Here you have the Sanjak of Zor, the Aleppo Vilayet, the Syria Vilayet, the Beirut Vilayet, and the Muta Sarafate of Jerusalem. These are taxing areas because the Ottoman Empire only cared about the taxing bodies. So we're into the Ottoman Empire for 435 years, and it's Turkish, and there are no nations there. In fact, there were no Arab nations anywhere because the Arabs had no nations. They only had tribes, and that was addressed soon. Next. All right. In about 1858, around April of 1858, there were reformers, and like Midhat Pasha, and Midhat Pasha said, look, we're into all these lands. Why don't you let people own property? Because the fact of the matter is that the Sultan owned everything. Every inch of the Ottoman Empire was in fact had special sovereignty of the Sultan. And so they looked at the land codes of the United States, of France, of England, and they, for the first time in 1858, developed the Ottoman Land Code. And from the Ottoman Land Code, people were entitled to own land so that they could say, this is my land, not just work the land for the government or for the ownership, but actually have some land. And I've examined these records. They're in Turkish, written out in Arabic script. Each one is about this big, and 99% of them are fraudulent because there's no maps, no surveys, and nobody wanted to be honest about how much land they had or controlled for two reasons. Because if you registered your land, you had to pay what? Taxes, and one of your sons would have to go where?
The army.
The army, correct. So that's why they're fundamentally all fraudulent, and after the first year of land ownership under the Ottoman Land Registration Act, only 2 lands were registered in all of the 3 continents in which they had sway. Next. So this is 1900 already. We're getting closer, folks. And as you can see, this is from the Library of Congress. And as you can see, this is the Arab area here. But this is the Jewish area. And the Jewish area had created a majority within Jerusalem. So there was always a Jewish majority in Jerusalem. Now it's true, because there were settlements that were Arab, that were Christian, that were Jewish. If you take the entire region, then you say, well, the Jews were just a fraction of the land in 1900. But they were the overwhelming majority of the land in the Jewish cities like Jerusalem. Next. All right. War declared, 1914. And Germany and the Ottoman Empire, the Kaiser and the Sultan get into a war with the rest of Europe. It becomes World War I. 25 million people died. No historian, no scholar, no statesman, no foreign ministry can tell you why. No one knows why we fought World War I. No one. But we did have this war, and because the Ottoman Emperor, the Ottoman Sultan, joined with the Germans, they became the allies to lose. Next. Oh, let's go back to the other one. Now, how did America get into the war? I'll wait for that. Okay. So let's go. Not that one, the one before. That one there. Next. Next. To the right. Next, one more. So as soon as the Ottoman Empire entered the war, they said, well, we just killed all the Armenians, 1.4 million, and now we're going to kill all the Jews. In Jaffa, in Tel Aviv, and in the Holy Land. And the Germans intervened with their allies, the Turk, to say, look, don't actually kill them. Just expel them. Throw them out. And so here you see a picture of the Jews it was on Passover, all the Jews were expelled from the Holy Land in that area by the Turks. And how did they get taken out? Next picture. On American medical evacuation ships. And so they took them out to Greece, they took them out to Egypt, they took them out to any place but there, and they were spared. Ultimately, they get back in. And sometimes during this lecture, let's see, next one, I will refer to Wikipedia, not because Wikipedia is anything to rely upon, but even Wikipedia knows that in 1917, 10,000 people from Jaffa, including Tel Aviv, and 8,000 Jews were all evicted by the Pasha, evicted from their homes. Next. So the U.S. finally entered the war. We must fight for justice and rights. Okay, who in the room knows why the U.S. entered the war? Anybody know? Anybody know? Not you, you know I told you last night at the Japanese restaurant. There was a guy, a bandit, called Pancho Villa. Okay, Pancho Villa was a German spy. And Pancho Villa was hired by the Germans to cross the border and raid the US military and other installations to provoke a military response. Wilson sent our #1 general to bring Pancho Villa's head to Washington. He couldn't catch him, he couldn't stop him, and this convinced the Germans that America was incapable of fighting a war alongside England and France when they couldn't even muster enough military to catch one bandito. And so the foreign ministry sent the famous Zimmerman telegram. Okay? Does anyone know who signed the Zimmerman telegram? Anybody know? Anybody know? Do you know? Who? That's right, Zimmerman. Zimmerman signed the Zimmerman telegram. And the famous Zimmerman telegram stated that if Mexico joins with Germany against the United States in World War I, Germany will give Mexico back Texas, Arizona, Utah, California, and all the lands taken after the Treaty of Hidalgo. And when Wilson got the secret decipher of that, he said, that's it, we're going to war. That's a crappy telegram, we're going to war. America had no military, didn't know how to go to war. Naturally, they had no mechanized stuff, it was all horses, and they had to rent all the guns and the cannons from the French. But that's how we got into the war. So now World War I is on. We're fighting the Turks. The Turks own the entire Middle East. There are no Arab countries. There is no Israel. There is no Jewish country. But there's a big Zionist movement. And one guy invented the Arab national movement. And that was Lawrence of Arabia. He said, you're not just tribes, you actually deserve to have your own country. I said, what are you talking about? He said, you'll find out soon. Next. And this led to many groups wishing to have their own state because this was the era of self-determination. The end of the 18th century, saw the rise of nationalism. And that means that countries thought that they should rule themselves and not be subject to the whims of foreign dictation in Paris, in France, and so they bound together in different national identities, whether it was cultural, geographical, linguistic, religious. They said, we have Armenians, we have Greeks, and one of the groups that wanted to come back was the Jews. And the Jews wanted to come back from where they were expelled, even though there was always a Jewish presence maintained in Jerusalem and the Galilee throughout the expulsion period. And that led to the Balfour Declaration. Has everybody heard about the Balfour Declaration? Okay, this is the single most powerful 67 words in diplomatic history. But it's important to understand that this piece of paper, which was issued on November 2nd of 1917, at the very end of the, as the war is drawn to a close, had no power, was not a legal instrument, it was nothing but pretty stationery. And now I'm going to explain to you what the Balfour Declaration said and what it didn't say. You'll be little experts on the Balfour Declaration. Because a lot of people blame the British Balfour Declaration. You see it signed by Lord Balfour. Let's make this a little larger, Carol. Control plus. Well, that's good enough. and just come down a little bit so we can see more of this. Okay. The letter goes to Lord Rothschild. And the reason it went to Lord Rothschild is because they were afraid to send it to the Zionist organization, of which Chaim Weizmann was the head. And remember, Chaim Weizmann was a chemist, and he invented the chemical combination that allowed the British to shoot thousands of artillery shells at any given time. So, because they couldn't send it to the ZO, because if they did, the Turks and the Germans would return to trying to slaughter the remaining Jews in Israel. It was written to Lord Rothschild, who was not a Zionist and who had no interest, but the Jews who he helped bring there were interested in being close to Jerusalem, in being close to the Holy Land. And it says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine, the realm renamed by the Romans for the Greek island invaders, of a national home, notice it says national home, for the Jewish people, comma, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities of Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, they were afraid that if they actually called it a Jewish state instead of a national home, that the Jews would be expelled from Berlin, from Brooklyn, from Buenos Aires, from Mexico, from Switzerland, and expelled from their country. And for this reason, it says that it will not impact the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country, because they're worried about Mexico City and Montreal. And it says here that a national home for the Jewish people will be made, will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. What does that mean? It means they already made 5 other Arab countries. That's what they were planning to do. Lebanon, Syria, ultimately Iraq, modern Hijaz, ultimately Jordan, ultimately modern Egypt. And they said all of those will be Islamic states. All of those will be Arab states. But one will be a Jewish state. And in that Jewish state, the existing Arab population will have no national rights. What will they have? Civil rights, legal rights, religious rights, rights of equality, civil rights, human rights. That's something they actually didn't have in the other parts of the Middle East. And so this is the Balfour Declaration. But this was not issued just by the British. It was virtually simultaneously issued by governments all over the world. The same language, because it was all negotiated. So when they say, oh, look what the British did to us. No, it wasn't that. It was a global movement. Next. This is the French Balfour Declaration. And it says virtually the same thing. Next. This is the Turkish Balfour Declaration by Mehmet Pasha. And Mehmet Pasha, remember, the land was sovereign to Ottoman Empire. They owned the land. And he said, we're giving you your own state. There are no states, but when we get dismantled, we're giving you your own state along with Egypt and Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and all these others. Next, here's Haddon Buschihabenhausen. Once again, the allies of the German, they made their Balfour Declaration, given in the same way, with virtually the same wording. Next. And this is Stephen Pichon, who also helped reissue a second version of the French Balfour Declaration, which was slightly updated. Next. And the Japanese, Shinda, the Japanese issued their version of the Balfour Declaration. So you need to know this was a worldwide undertaking that would express itself in international law. The pieces of paper, the telegrams, the messages, they had no value in international law, but they expressed the will and intent of those nations. Next. And here in the United States, we have Stephen Wise, the head of the American Jewish Congress, constantly in touch with the White House, and it was told to him, the White House shall also issue our Balfour Declaration. But we won't do it till the war is over. We won't do it now in advance. And so we have the next one is Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson said, I will issue a recognition of a Jewish state and a homeland, but I won't do it till the war is over. Because I remember the Zimmerman telegram where they said they're going to give parts of the United States back to Mexico, so I'm not going to prejudge the matter by saying I'm giving parts of the Ottoman Empire back to somebody else. And I ask once again, who signed the Zimmerman telegram? Anybody know? Zimmerman telegram? Zimmerman, correct. All right, next. And the Russians also issued their version of the Balfour Declaration. This is the meeting with Lev Kamensky at that's the communists and the Germans at Brest-Litovsk. The Russians said, we're leaving the war, we're getting rid of the Tsar, and on the way out, we're going to agree with this Balfour Declaration. And one of the reasons was all of these people, for one reason or another, thought the Jews had some kind of power. And because they had some kind of power, they were going to take this political move. Now it's true that many people wanted to help the Jews. Many people thought that the Jews would make a great state. In fact, tomorrow I'll be speaking on the boycott that hit Tuesday. I'll be speaking at Mount Sinai. Monte Sinai, as they say here. And about why Hitler responded to the Jewish threat to make a boycott. And then the next day I'll be at Magen David, talking about IBM and the Holocaust, and I ask you all to please attend. So all of these countries, all over the world, and these are the main players of the war. And the people who actually are sovereign say, we're making all of these Arab countries and one Jewish country. And that Jewish country will not have Islamic principles, but democratic principles. And we're putting it in the paperwork. Next. And so the Arabs were actually in favor of the Jewish state in Palestine, which was named not for Arabs, but for Greek island invaders by the conquering Romans. And does anybody know who this guy is? Faisal, correct, the son of Hussein. He was the elected representative of the Syrian Democratic Congress, in this case the Second Syrian Democratic Congress, and what they wanted was they wanted an Arab state, not in Palestine, but in Syria. Because Syria, contrary to the non-Arab Turkish Caliphate, Syria was the center of gravity for the Islamic world and the Arab world for so long. And this is January of 1919 in Eilat, and he's having a meeting here. And who was this guy? Chaim Weizmann. And you got to look at this guy. He's got the shmata up here. He's got a three-piece suit. He's got rings on his hand, and he's meeting in the middle of the desert in a tent with Faisal. But they made a contract, the original two-state solution, and it was engineered and witnessed by this guy. Anyone know who this might be? Lawrence of Arabia. So they all got there, and this contract that they don't talk about is public. It's in Wikipedia. It is known, but you are going to know exactly what this said. Next. Here's the contract, just so you see, and it's His Royal Highness, the Emir Faisal, representing and acting on behalf of the Arab Kingdom of Hijaz, which of course is now known as Saudi Arabia, and Dr. Chaim Weizmann representing and acting on behalf of the Zionist organization. Mindful of the racial kinship and ancient bonds existing between the Arabs and the Jewish people, and realizing that the surest means of working out the consummation of their national aspirations is through the closest possible collaboration in the development of the Arab state and Palestine. Notice they only use the word Arab state or Arabs, and the word Palestinian means Zionist, Jewish Zionist. And it says that we are being desirous of further confirming the good understanding that exists between them. We have agreed on the following. Next. Right, coming down, let's go to Article 1. Article 1. The Arab state, not the Palestinian state, and Palestine, which meant the Jews, in all their relations and understanding shall be controlled by the most cordial goodwill and understanding. And to this end, Arab, come down a little more. All right, let's go to the next one. Arab and Jewish duly accredited agents shall be established and maintained in their respective territories. So we'll send down a Syrian guy, and the ZO will send down a guy. Article 2. Immediately following the completion of the deliberations of the peace conference, that's the Paris Peace Conference, in the summer of 1919, decided how they would carve up Turkey. What states would be identified? Would Armenia be a state? Would the Jewish people have a state? Would there be a state in Syria? Immediately after that, the boundaries between the Arab state and Palestine shall be determined by a border commission, ordinary, to be agreed upon by the parties here too. Let's go to the next one, Article 3. Oh, let's go back one. Come down to Article 3. In the establishment of the Constitution and the administration of Palestine, all such measures shall be adopted as will afford the fullest guarantees for carrying into effect the British government's declaration of the 2nd of November. This says we accept the Balfour Declaration, which has also been accepted by governments around the world. Next, let's go down one more. All necessary measures shall be taken to encourage and stimulate immigration of Jews into Palestine on a large scale, and as quickly as possible to settle Jewish immigrants upon the land through closer settlement. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Settlement, Jewish settlement, was considered to be part of international law when it was first conceived right there. An intensive cultivation closer and intensive cultivation. Because they figured the Jews are going to come in, they're modern, they have electricity, they have machinery, they're going to make a big explosion in land, and our guys are going to work the land, and our guys will rise their economic aspirations as well. Next. In taking such measures, the Arab peasants and tenant farmers, remember I said nobody owned their own land? They were all tenant farmers on the rich man's land. And that rich man was generally Turkish or Armenian. In fact, only 8%, remember this, of the land when Israel was declared a state was owned privately by individuals, Arab individuals. The rest was owned by the Turkish government. So they shall be protected in their rights and shall be assisted in forwarding their economic development. Come down, please. No, Article 5, no regulation nor law shall be made prohibiting or interfering in any way with the free exercise of religion. When the hell was that ever discussed in the Islamic conquest? That's from the U.S. Constitution. And further, the free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preference shall forever be allowed. No religious test shall ever be required for the exercise of civil and political rights. The Jews will have a nation state, and everybody in it will have equal civil rights and religious rights. And this text is ripped right from the heart of the U.S. Constitution and other freedom-loving documents in the Western world. Next. But it says right here, come down a little bit. There's an addendum. Chaim Weizmann signs it, and Faisal signs it. But the fact is, Faisal puts an addendum here. He says, you will get what you want as long as we get what we want. Okay? That didn't happen. For that we can thank France. Next. And there is Faisal at the Paris Peace Con in 1919, and he's sitting right next to the Japanese guy, and there's Lawrence of Arabia. Here's the Japanese guy. Here's the French guy. Here, this guy is one of the African diplomats, and there's his sword. He takes a tremendous picture, you got to admit. And he is ready for my Arab state in Syria, and then the Jews get their state in Palestine, because we don't care about Palestine, because it's a backwater and no one actually cares about it. We care about Syria. Next. And then comes the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations was the prior organization of the United Nations. The League of Nations, there's a lot for me to criticize. They did nothing to promote peace. They promoted a great deal of oil exploitation and colonialization. But the fact is that the League of Nations represented all of these countries, and the League of Nations, about 60 countries in the world, and the League of Nations established a treaty. This is the basis of international law. And it says in Article 22, to those colonies and territories which as a consequence of the late war have ceased to be under the sovereignty of the states, Ottoman Empire, which formerly governed them and which are inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world. You see, they're talking down to these people. They say, you know, this is what we like an Arab on a mule, and you don't really know what you're doing, so we are going to be your sugar daddy. So, that there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples form a sacred trust of civilization, that securities for the performance of this trust should be embodied in this covenant. Next. And they made the Arab kingdom of Syria. They made the Arab state. They made the state for the that was negotiated. And this is in Wikipedia because I want you to understand how established is the reason I'm using these URLs is because this is not from my basement. This is not from my archives. Any of you at home on your phones can access any of this information at the press of a button. They made the Arab kingdom of Syria. Next. And it was a real country. It had its own currency. Next. And ultimately, it was accepted through the Treaty of the San Remo Convention. They met in San Remo, and all of the entities involved in the war, except for the Ottoman Empire, which held off because it needed to make a border adjustment, all of those entities in the San Remo said, whereas the principal allied powers have agreed that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917. That's the Balfour Declaration. It's not the declaration that has power, it's the fact that it's quoted in here that gives its legitimacy. By the government of His Majesty and adopted by the said powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities of Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any country. This is the bedrock of international law. It's the San Remo Convention. Convention is really an agreement only between the powers. There's actually no such thing as international law. International law does not exist when you use the word law. If you kill somebody in Mexico City, you don't get to choose whether or not you'll be tried for murder. But in international law, it's only the high contracting parties who agree whether they will or will not be governed by what they have agreed to. They call it international law. It's like natural hairspray. It doesn't really exist, but I'm using that word, international law, the way it is now. Next. And this was the Jewish mandate for Palestine. 120,000 square kilometers. There is Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the Arabian Hijaz, Egypt, and this is it. And this was supposed to be Israel. Has anyone in the room seen this map? This is Jewish Palestine. Next. However, the French did not agree to Arab control of Syria and Lebanon. They had many Christian convents there, they had Christian schools, and so they basically kicked Faisal out of Syria. They killed about 10,000 guys in a battle. They came at him with lances and bows and arrows, and the French used tanks and cannon and slaughtered these guys. Faisal was given 48 hours to quit Syria, and he did quit Syria, and then they made Lebanon, and they made Syria as French-dominated states, and Faisal was out of there. So the Syrian Congress said, wait a minute, why are the Jews getting their state, and we didn't pick up on Syria? So they said, we now resist any Zionist state of the Jews in Palestine. Next. And about that time, the Ottoman Empire, which owned all that territory as the sovereign, agreed, yes, we agree to the mandates, we finally accept, we had a border a disagreement, we agreed to the mandates, we agreed that Jewish Palestine should exist as the country that has been established under international law. Remember, the League of Nations, the United Nations, and Joe Biden may not create a Jewish state, an Arab state, or any other state. The only one who has the right to create a state is the people themselves. It's up to everybody else to recognize or not recognize what the people have declared. Next. And so the Arabs are upset, and they decided, okay, we're going to give you another state. We're going to make up a state. And we're going to call that state Jordan. Jordan never existed. There is no ancient Jordan. Jordan was created by a memo by Winston Churchill one weekend in Cairo. They say he was tipsy, and that's why the border is so zigzaggy on the bottom. That's often disputed. But the fact is, they took 73% of the Jewish state and made another two-state solution. After the other five-state solution and the other two-state solution, yet another two-state solution. And that was Jordan. They took three mainly empty provinces of the Ottoman Empire across from Jordan. And the word Jor is Arabic for south. And the word Dan means the Dan River. So south of the Dan River was Jordan. Next. And here is the memo, issued at Geneva, 1922, September 16th at 4:30 p.m., exercising a twisted pretzel version of Article 25 of the mandate for Palestine, and saying, we will now make two countries there. 73% of the territory we gave to the Jews, legally, under international province, as part of a five-nation arrangement, give 73% of that to this brand new country called Jordan that never existed before and didn't even have a real name except south of the Dan River. Next. And this is what it came out to be. Here's Jordan. Here's the little zigzag that they call it Winston's hiccup. That's probably not accurate. And that's the other side. They were called it Trans-Jordan, the other side of the Jordan River. Next. And even if you go to the official royal page of King Hussein, because what they did is because the Brits said to Faisal, because you were kicked out of Syria, we're making you the king of Iraq. Who made Faisal the king of Iraq? The king of England made him the king of Iraq. So it's always good to be the king, and if you're a king, you can make a little king. And they put Faisal in there, and as a consolation prize, they gave his brother Jordan. Abdullah was given as Jordan. Next. And finally, the mandate emerges in the League of Nations, agreed to by all the countries of the world that recognized had sovereignty, that were all part of the League of Nations. The enemies and the allies all agreed on the mandate for Jewish Palestine. And what does it say here? The administration of Palestine, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sections of the population are not prejudiced, and shall facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions, shall encourage, in cooperation with the Jewish agency referred to in Article 4, close settlement by Jews on the land. We need Jewish settlement on the land, including state lands and wastelands not required for public purposes. So the other 92% of the land that belonged to the Turkish government was immediately put into that category. And under the Ottoman Land Registration Act, if you didn't pay your taxes, which no one wanted to pay your taxes, and the land was left fallow for 10 years, the land is cheated back to the state. So the Ottoman Empire owned this land. Now notice it says Jewish Agency. Can everybody see that? And notice it's not a capital A. It's a small a. And notice it says that this agency, referred to in Article 4, is what international law is relying upon. We go up to Article 4, right here, and the name of that organization is the Zionist Organization. That's right, the Zionist Organization, the one you know today, the one that exists in Jerusalem, Mexico, and the United States, was the original entity recognized to be in charge of the Jewish immigration. And what they said was, okay, you need an agency with a little a, we'll invent a new agency, we'll call it the Jewish Agency. And that's how the Jewish Agency got its name, with the big A, to fulfill the mandate here that required them to have a Jewish agency. Next. And this is what it ultimately came to look like. Transjordan and Palestine, British mandate, and of course they thought the oil from Iraq would go across here to Haifa and across here to through Lebanon, because the Brits needed oil and the French only had olive oil. And so because the French only had olive oil, they had 56 importers of Arabian oil, and those 56 importers were put into one company called Total, the total of 56 companies. And then on the British side, the company became known as British Petroleum, Anglo-Palestine Oil Company. Next. And here it is. These same words are signed by a joint resolution of the Congress, the House and the Senate, in recognition of the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people. Remember, throughout this entire period, until 1964, there's nothing to call an Arab a Palestinian. The only guy who's a Palestinian is a Jewish Zionist. The Anglo-Palestine Trust, the Palestine Orchestra, Palestine football team, the Palestine Post, they're all Jews. We're talking about identity theft. I'll get more to that later. Next. And here it is on the Liberty Bell. Because the Christian Jewish world, the millennialists, believed in the Jewish return to Zion. And right here on the Liberty Bell, it says, Leviticus 25:10, proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof. That's the Liberty Bell. You can see it now in Philadelphia if it's still standing. Next. And this International Court of Justice that you just heard about with the South African complaint on genocide was invented right after that. And its very first case was, can we actually make one entity, Jewish Palestine, into two because of the Transjordan Memo? And they agreed yes, thus giving case law to international law. Next. And the United Nations Charter, because the League of Nations, which never did anything to stop Hitler, which never did anything to stop the rape of Nanking, never did anything to stop the invasion of Ethiopia, of Libya and North Africa by the Italians. Never did anything to stop any of the massacres that took place across the entire realm. They gave up their rights, and they said, we're pushing it all to the United Nations. And thus the United Nations was born. But because the mandate was not yet final, there is a provision in the UN Charter that recognizes the Balfour Agreement in the mandate. And we go down to Article 80. And it says, except as may be agreed upon in individual trusteeship agreements and made under these articles, placing each territory under a trusteeship system, and until such agreements have been concluded, nothing in this chapter shall be construed in or of itself to alter in any manner the rights whatsoever of any states or any peoples, or the terms of existing international instruments to which members of the United Nations may respectively be parties. And that means that when the UN was born, in its charter, accepted the it accepted the mandate, it accepted the Jewish state, it accepted the second state being Jordan, it accepted all of the other states. And even though matters were not final, it said we accept them, it's still not being final. Next. All right, and here's the UN partition plan. Obviously, nothing was working. The Arabs would not quit the area because the Arabs would not live in equality across the fence from the Jewish people. It comes down to that. It's got nothing to do with land. Has nothing to do with sovereignty. It's only, can we live next door to Jews? They would not accept that. So, finally, the UN made Resolution 181, General Assembly. It's not binding. Only Security Council is binding. General Assembly means we suggest. And what do they suggest? Come on down. Here, the plan of partition. Arab state. Jewish state. Why did they say a Jewish state and an Arab state? Because there were no Palestinians, Arab Palestinians, at that time. In point of fact, there's not one document, one headline, one organization, one photograph, one letter that suggests any Arab Palestinian entity or activity. Next. Israel was made, and the Arab states all got together, and they said, we're going to expel our 850,000 Jews from Morocco to Syria. We're going to take away their property overnight. We're going to take away their citizen rights overnight. We're going to expel them. The expulsion. Next. They did it publicly. Even the New York Times says Jews in grave danger in all Muslim lands. 900,000 in Africa and Asia face the wrath of their foes. They were all expelled. They took the earrings off of their earlobes. They took the bracelets off of their wrists. They took the metal off of their ankles. They kicked them out with nothing, and they said, you've got to come pick these up and take them to Israel. Because we want Israel to have a humanitarian bomb. Why do we need to kill these guys when we can just overnight put 850,000 Jews into Israel with not a penny in their pocket? And so the air lifts began. Everybody knew it. It was public. Nobody said a word. There is no UN agency addressing it. Next. And there we see the Jews from Yemen they don't even know what an airplane is. They're being thrown out of the country. Where remember, the Jews lived in the Arab lands for 2,700 years. That's a millennium, 1,000 years before Muhammad. And they helped build up those nations. And now they're being thrown out, their property is taken. Next. And here you see they're landing, and they're being helped across with tiny little bundles. And they're coming into Israel for the first time. Next. And here you see that they're landing right in Israel and they're being welcomed by the medical staff. And what is the name of the airline that flew them? Wrong. They just had the stairway. Alaska Airlines. Alaska Airlines flew them in. Next. And that's one of the pilots. He just died about a year ago. He is one of the pilots, not Jewish, that flying for Alaska Airlines, and he would fly, they'd shoot at him, he'd drop the people, come back, make these little circuits, and save 850,000 Jews. And how do I know it's him? Next. Because there I am talking to the guy. Next. And so, in May of 1964, identity theft occurs. The KGB and the Arab League create an entity called the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, is part of the Cold War. To steal the Jewish identity, you could go and you could watch Cast a Giant Shadow, and you'll see what's wrong with you Palestinians. Watch Exodus, and Paul Newman is constantly called the Palestinian commander. So, come down a little bit. A little more. A little more. Right here. First PNC, composed of 422 representatives, met in Jerusalem May 1964 and adopted the Palestine National Covenant, also called the Charter. That's the invention of the PLO and the invention of the Palestinian people, which is why Golda Meir says it's the invention of a people that never existed. They took our names. Next. And so, the Arabs themselves, it's been documented, and I have the original archival materials, that the Arabs denied the existence of any place called Palestine. Next. This is, for instance, come down just a little bit. Zohar Mosen. And Zohar Mosen was one of the top PLO officials. Let's see what he said. He gave an interview to a Dutch paper. He said the Palestinian people do not exist. There are no differences between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. We are part of one people, the Arab nation. Lo and behold, I have relatives with Palestinian, Lebanese, Jordanian, and Syrian citizenship. We are one people. It is only for political reasons that we carefully endorse our Palestinian identity. It's all about the struggle against Israel and for Arab unity. And I can tell you right now, there's no word in the Arabic language for Palestinian nationalism. It does not exist. Next. And here it is again. He was saying that all over, and there are many other quotes like that. I won't spend the next 20 minutes giving them to you. Next. And there we see, this is the flag of Palestine. Next. And this is the flag of Syria. It's fundamentally the same flag. Next. And this is the flag of Jordan. Fundamentally the same flag. Next. And then, because of the invasion in 1948, which was illegal, Jordan took an area of Judea and Samaria and renamed it the West Bank. Never existed, never had that name, but it was the West Bank of the Jordan River. And in Jericho, and they had the Jericho Conference and two others like it, in which they said, everybody vote, and everybody agreed. You're not Palestinian citizens, you're Jordanian citizens, because there's no such place as Palestine. Next. And here is a picture of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, and he's here in the Jericho Conference, and they have these local conferences to ratify that they are citizens of Jordan. and or southern Syria, but they are not citizens of any Palestinian or Jewish entity or any national entity from the river to the sea. Next. And then, when Israel came back and took these same lands that it had in before losing them in 1948, in 1967, we see the Temple Mount. Everybody aware of the Temple Mount? Did you ever ask yourself this question? Why is it that the Temple Mount is controlled not by the local Arabs, but by another country called Jordan? You ever ask that question? Because my friend Moshe Dayan gave it to him in the 6-Day War. Next. And here's the picture of Moshe Dayan meeting in the 6-Day War with the Arab elders, with the Waqf, and saying, okay, you guys we give it to you. We don't want to conquer your mosque. We don't want to run your religion. You run your own religion. Next. And that brings us to the so-called illegal actions of Israel. The illegal actions of Israel are primarily, in terms of land, based on one sentence misinterpreted in the Fourth Geneva Convention. The Fourth Geneva Convention. Come down, this is Article 49. It specifically says, the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. And this was done specifically to stop people like the Nazis from invading territory. And that means that if Israel sets up a wonderful factory called SodaStream to employ local Arabs and pay them the same price as everyone else, if they do that, they're allegedly, it's not correct, violating this part of it. Obviously, anybody else wants to go in there and set up land. If you want to be a Mormon, if you want to be the Catholic Church and set up such a factory, let's give them the Nobel Prize. But if a Jew just goes in there to pay decent wages, then they are so-called committing a war crime. Next. And that brings us to the so-called occupation. Now this is where you could really mess up someone who's arguing with you. Somebody says it's occupied, and you say that's against international law. And they say yes. You say which one? There is no law against occupation in international law. None. That's how come the United States could occupy Berlin, the United States could occupy Japan, the United States could occupy Baghdad with provisional governments. The definition of occupation was made in 1907 in the Hague Regulations by Belgium and Russia. At the time, Russia was committing genocide against the Jews with its pogroms, and Belgium was committing genocide against the Congolese with its rubber plantations. And here is the word. Territory, this is from the Red Cross. Territory is considered occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. That means if Israel is in Gaza City or Khan Yunis, but it's not assessing taxes, it's not issuing parking permits, it has no civilian authority, it's not occupying. And it cannot be occupying the West Bank because there's already an international agreement called the Oslo Accords, which specifically breaks the area up into A, B, and C. And how can everybody say that Israel is occupying a place where it has been agreed, including by the Arabs and the Palestinian Authority, that they shall have sovereignty, and where there's a big red sign saying no Israeli may go. But under Oslo, there is a security arrangement where the Israelis have a right to go in and strike against terror. And so what you see now is fake refugees and a fake refugee in fake refugee camps supported by a fake refugee agency, UNRWA, as part of a fake body of world, a fake body of world peace. The fake body of world peace is called the United Nations, controlled by 5 countries, invented by 5 countries, the United States, France, and England, also Maoist China and Stalinist Russia, and they had no intention of fighting for liberty, and they're still running it, which is why the UN cannot stop anything in Ukraine, and they cannot stop the genocide against the Uyghurs in China. And you cannot, my parents were Holocaust refugees. They were in a DP camp. They waited 2 years for a number. I was born in Chicago. I'm not a refugee. As soon as you get to another place, you are not a refugee. But the way it's defined now, the refugees from this Arab from 1948 in perpetuity, generation to generation, they're official refugees. Even if they're born in New York and they own a $1 million Park Avenue suite, only the Palestinians. They have their own agency. It's not like the one my parents were in, the UN Refugee Agency, not like the Ukrainians, not like the Rohingyas. They get their own thing, and you have to ask yourself, why is there a refugee camp in Ramallah? These places have first-class shopping centers, 5-star hotels. They're not real refugee camps. Pick yourself up and walk across the street. You're out of the refugee camp. It's all to provoke the responses that they are provoking. And it says the occupation applies only to the territory where such authority is established and in a position to assert itself. And it ends when you leave. And when the Israelis left Gaza and the Gazans took over with the Palestinian Authority, then there was no occupation next. And this brings up to mind the question of the hospitals. Under international law, the laws of war, hospitals must be protected. But a hospital, under international law, loses its protected status once it has any military involvement. No longer a hospital. So if we go down, this here is also the Red Cross page, and it says, come now. Specific protection of medical establishments and units, including hospitals, is the general rule under international humanitarian law. Therefore, specific protection to which hospitals are entitled shall not cease unless they are used by a party to the conflict to commit outside their humanitarian functions and act harmful to the enemies. These organizations, these UNRWA, these camps, these schools, lose all protection once they become part and parcel of the giant Hamas terror war. Let's go to the last one. And here is an excellent way that you know that the Jews were the original Palestinians. Here's a headline from the New York Times. Arabs to boycott Palestinian goods. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Now, when somebody says to you, Israel's violating international law, you say, which one? And you have the proof going all the way back to the beginning of time. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.